open that door.
The text of the.
Yeah, this one's because narrative and universalities, right?
So we'll look up this most. It says definitionally. So this is one thing. This,
Okay, yeah.
Does that make sense? Okay. This is the other thing.
Yeah.
And then I think there's one more, but you can like write if you have
Did you guys do the sound check on this one?
Yeah.
Wait, did you actually? You should actually check like with speaking over there.
It might be too
Like-
far.
Kevin and I record rounds in
All the
exactly
time.
the system.
Like unless
Oh,
it's broken.
never mind.
Did you pause it or is it?
No, I just misfocused it though. I think it's entirely focused on Catherine now.
Okay. Maybe
Just
stop it and start it.
with like voice. Right.
Please don't give me cancer for now. I don't need this in my life.
It's not cancer, it's AIDS.
But AIDS is.
It only took like 20 hours
That's
in a
funny.
car.
They have an awful immune
I
system. I was good after a week of barely eating. They've been going like 2 weeks.
It's the debate tournaments, man. They're killing me.
Yeah, I didn't go to any debate tournaments.
Such a piece of shit, Dennis.
Justifiability of actions.
Potentially.
You need a
I need to think about how to like
Okay.
flash it out.
I just need your phone to record the time. Okay.
Yes.
Let's get the fuck out of here. Okay. Is everyone good?
You need to actually. I don't think it's actually.
It was recording.
Oh.
Let's just stop it.
Okay, so there's still the stop symbol, so I assume it's recording.
I can check.
Okay, that's a good idea. I don't trust
Is
myself.
there a square?
Yes,
Then it's
but I don't trust
recording.
myself.
Okay,
So.
we're good. Did you zoom in? I'm gonna zoom out. I totally zoomed in a little.
Did I? I just
No, you're good. You're good.
No, I just like unfocused it. I didn't.
Beautiful.
I think I'm gonna flip this way.
Okay.
Wait, give me a sec.
What's your codes that have hit? Okay, let's begin. This House regrets the narrative of universality regarding human rights. We say that this is not around about whether or not the universality of human rights is good or bad. It's a question of whether or not the statement is harmful and whether or not in the past has been bad. So here's our model. In 1948, the UN wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which really principally started the narrative of universality. It said that shelter, liberty, and food should be extended to each person. The narrative is that every person on earth deserves the same human rights and like these same fundamental rights. Any question on the model? Okay, the first argument that we give is that the narrative of universality regarding human rights creates a false sense of solving human rights issues. This occurs in 3 key ways. First, it discourages people in power from solving human rights issues because they can claim that they adhere to the text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So, for instance, the government of Canada can claim that they are protecting the people with liberty, with shelter, and with food. However, it doesn't have to adhere to the issues of economic justice and the massive poverty in the indigenous underclass that they have in their population, not at this time. Second, we tell you that it creates a false sense of solving human rights issues and that there is a narrative of entitlement that is not persuasive to people in power. For instance, people in Palo Alto feel as though they're really lacking in their human rights, when in fact they really have a much different situation of living than people in Saudi Arabia who literally do not have the right to go out without their male protector. We tell you that people in power are very unlikely to agree with the narrative of entitlement because they are inherently less marginalized in that they have risen to power. So for instance, we give you the example of women in Saudi Arabia who demand that they have access to their human rights. They say, we lack human rights. We lack the right to drive. We lack the rights that people have in the West. However, the male monarchy is very unlikely to agree with women in Saudi Arabia when they make the claim that they are entitled to these universal human rights. It would be a much better persuasive tactic to garner human rights, but to say that this is our cultural context, this is what we have been denied by you historically, and we do not deserve these rights because people in other countries have them, but rather because they are fundamental to our own autonomy within the country. Third, we tell you that there is a false equivalency that is drawn between people in the global north and people in the global south. Those that are in the global north have substantially greater access to human rights than those that are in the global south. However, the international institutions ranging from the UN and in local governments claim that, I'll take you at the end of this point, claim that they, similarly have human rights issues of shelter, liberty, and like lack of access to food. We tell you that people in the Congo do not need human rights, as the West continually tells them. Rather, what they need is access to mosquito nets. They need access to vaccinations. These are tangible things that people in the global South lack substantially more, and so we tell you that we achieve them better on our side of the house by saying that certain marginalized classes of individuals need certain services more so. Top half.
Doesn't the fact that both the global south and the global north are equated to need the same human rights point out the disparity in rights achieved, in that the global south has fewer of these rights and we need to better solvency by seeing that contrast as you pointed out?
No. So highlighting the contrast doesn't occur because of our first argument. We tell you that a government, especially in the global south, can claim to adhere to the text of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, they don't in practice incorporate other human rights that are necessary, that are excluded, perhaps because the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written in contrast to the USSR and their demand for workers' rights. But moreover, we tell you that even if you buy opening opposition's contention that there is some contrast that is highlighted, you still don't resolve the contrast. You still have an ineffective narrative that is not actually used to gain people human rights. What are the implications of a false sense of solving human rights issues? We tell you that first, this means that human rights for the most marginalized are continually unaddressed. People who are the most marginalized, especially in the global south, are claimed as though they lack human rights, but we don't make specific advocacy for the things that they need to improve their quality of life beyond liberty, beyond food, beyond shelter. Furthermore, we tell you that government abuses continue because governments can stay in power by claiming that they adhere to this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The second case argument that we will give you is that the narrative of universality justifies intervention. This occurs for three reasons. First, liberty looks differently in different countries. So, for instance, Muslim women in the global south may want to be veiled, but in France they say that they're liberating Muslim women by tearing their hijabs off of their head. That means that France can use this justification that Muslim women are being enslaved by their religion in order to intervene in these other countries. Next, we tell you that intervention is justified because governance looks different from country to country, and the countries that have the most power, not only within the UN but within the globe on the whole, due to economics and military power, are Western liberal democracies. And they set the narrative for what is universal human rights, and so they claim that countries that do not adhere to their model of human rights are in fact not promoting human rights at all. So for instance, systems of indigenous governance where there's a matriarchy are delegitimized by Western liberal democracies as inefficient, and governance that have a strong Islamic component are also delegitimized and deemed insufficiently democratic. What this means is that countries like Iran that have an Islamic theocracy yet have democracy operating within it are constantly targets for intervention. Third, we tell you that economic systems look totally different in different countries because, for instance, in Chile in the 70s, there was the notion that they're limiting free commerce, and so there is no human rights for the Chilean people, and that justified a coup d'etat. What does this mean? We tell you that this leads to intervention in two different ways. First, it leads to regime change because powerful Western liberal democracies can intervene in foreign countries and overthrow their governments that they perceive to be not protecting human rights. This can lead to civil wars and further stagnate economics, meaning that people don't gain access to human rights. Furthermore, it leads to humanitarian interventions, like in Somalia. And this actually makes it less effective for people to have access to like vaccines or whatever opening opposition might say that you could provide, because it leads to conflict zones which prevent humanitarian assistance from being delivered. We tell you that civilian casualties result from this, and that universality is not in practice. Thank you.
That's bad.
Good job.
Is everyone ready? Yeah? Okay. Starting time now. Honorable Speaker, on site opening opposition, we think that there are, in fact, universal rights that every person is owed, and we think the narrative of this does good. First thing on the model, Kevin tells you that this is not about the narrative of universality being good or bad. We think, in fact, this round is only about that. He wants to limit the round to the 1948 UN, on specific rights, but recognize that the resolution does not say, specific human rights. It says the narrative of universal human rights in general. So we think that there is ground to have this debate about the general narrative. Further, Kevin might try to argue that that is the narrative of universal human rights, but we don't think that's true. We think that there's a broader narrative of human rights that persists largely throughout the West, saying that all people are owed a certain amount of things, often based in Lockean philosophy and enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. We think that it is certainly not only from this 1948 UN resolution, in that it is in our Constitution, which precludes that. So, let's go into some points of rebuttal. First, Kevin tells you that there is a false solvency. His only link to harms as a result of the universality of the narrative is that it discourages actual solvency because governments can have the optical illusion of saying that they have done something good. First, we think that universality highlights the fact that they have not done something good. If we believe that everyone is owed, respect, dignity, and choice, the limitation of those things is more easily pointed out insofar as it is universally believed that everyone is owed those things. But if you buy his definition of what human rights are, it is also easier to say, look, this government is depriving people of these three things. That is doing something wrong. We think that there's not a universal narrative of what people are owed if there's not a universal narrative of what people are owed, it is exceptionally difficult to point out when abuses are happening. We'll talk about that more in our positive matter. Second, we think that this is just non-unique, right? Kevin wants to make the argument that governments will be abusive and then say, no, we're not being abusive. We think that happens in every possible world that there is governments, right? So unless Kevin wants to argue that there shouldn't be governments because human rights are so harmful, I don't think that he gets any unique offense there. He doesn't tell you why it only happens on our side of the house. And third, we think that this is the only way they link into those harms, right? The other points are just general ideas, and he says this continues marginalization. We think this is he doesn't say any reason why, other than this, why marginalization is worse on their side of the house. On their second point, Kevin tells you that it justifies intervention and does colonial violence to the Muslim woman wearing hijab in France. We think that this not having specific that isn't true of specific human rights, right? So Kevin wants to limit the debate to a specific group of human rights defined by the UN, but we don't think that he gives any evidence as to why those specific rights he's talking about link into that. Rather, he's talking about universal rights. So he's already conceded our definition in this argument. So either you go with our definition, and we have to talk about this point from Kevin, or this doesn't stand at all. But we think that universality of points after this allows us to say that the woman with the hijab is being violated in that she is owed something that she is not getting. She is owed respect and dignity and choice over her own body, but she's not getting that. If there isn't a universal narrative that she is owed something, then when she is revoked, it is much harder to combat. The comparative narrative will just be that she's a terrorist. If you don't get to say she has she is owed a specific thing that she is not getting. Yes, talk about it.
You are strawmanning the model. We are not trying to claim that it is only the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but that largely modern narratives stem from that. Insofar as your model is talking about how the U.S. Constitution uses Lockean principles, why does the notion that liberty looks differently, governance look differently than democracies, and economics look differently than private property not apply?
That's great. He concedes our model. Here's an example. Fantastic. Then we agree about what the model is. We think that on our side of the house, he talks about liberty looking different governance looking different, and economics looking different, we think that you can respect a people's ability to choose all of those things for themselves by respecting their human rights to dignity, having respect and choice. Let's go into our points of positive matter. First, we think that the universality of human rights is uniquely good in that it allows us to better combat bias. 3 key reasons why this is true. First, in a world where the narrative is not that every human deserves human rights, we can ignore the harms of foreign and domestic abuse. For example, we can more easily ignore sweatshop labor in China where children are being abused. We can more easily do what we did before when we ignored the Rwandan genocide. Rwandan people came to us and said, "We are being killed, help us," and we ignored them because we had bias against them and didn't attribute to them universal human rights. We think attributing them universal human rights does good in combating that. And further, it allows us, saying that human rights are not universal allows us to perpetuate more domestic harms. Look to prisoners in the United States doing slave labor and dying fighting fires in California because we think that they lose their rights because they are not universal when they do something wrong. If a right is universal, it cannot be stripped of you because you did something. We think that we can only access that on our side of the house. The second way it combats bias is that it actively prescribes value to each person universally. That means every person is ascribed value. This directly combats what bias is. Bias is the idea that certain human beings have less value or don't have value at all. Starting from the point that human beings have value combats this idea, not at this time. Third way it combats bias is that it stops bias from developing when we have this narrative. This is starting from the point that everyone deserves respect, value, and choice, cuts it off at the head in that bias is the idea that some people aren't deserving of things. If you start from the fact that everyone is deserving of these things, it is a lot harder to reach the conclusion that they don't deserve these things. That's kind of like ridiculous. It is harder to think that black people are worse if you think that everyone deserves respect. So our second point of positive matter is that this narrative does uniquely good things in that 3 key reasons why this is true. First, it builds relatability in that there is more sympathy to the least well-off in society. The deprivation of rights is wrong for everyone, and as Kevin talks about, people in Palo Alto are upset when they have a right deprived, which we agree is less frequent, but in that they have sympathy for that experience, they are more likely to have sympathy for the least well-off who more frequently have their rights deprived, and if we have a narrative of what rights are inappropriate to deprive, they will have more sympathy and be able to point to the fact, oh look, this person in the Congo is being deprived of 10 rights, and that's very terrible. So, second way, we say that it strengthens movements in that they can band together because because they value the rights are being deprived instead of utility. We think that it would be more white feminism could achieve more if they left behind intersectional people, but they don't do that because they respect the dignity of everyone and will fight for them. Further, we look to the example of queer people and trans people in their movements. Gay people could probably have more success in their unique agenda if they left behind trans people, but they don't do that because they respect their human dignity. Third point is that we think we better combat the narrative of neoliberal globalization, where people are only their market value, in that we won't leave people in the third world behind as often. Thank you. We're proud to oppose.
Alright, so what exactly is the narrative of the universality surrounding human rights, right? We think it's this idea that everyone is absolutely deserving of the same thing, right? We think it's the idea that the Muslim woman who wants to wear the veil and participate in a certain type of family structure, who wants the right to participate in her own religion, has the exact same needs and the exact same human rights deserving to her as the children in Congo who need mosquito nets and vaccines, as the people in Palo Alto who are fighting for equal wages against workplace discrimination. We think, in fact, these problems are very disparate and have very disparate solutions, which means that this narrative is fundamentally unhelpful and obfuscates us from actually accessing the specific issues that are unique to different populations. We think making general statements like human rights abuses is fundamentally unhelpful, right? Opposition comes up here and tells you that, we think some people, basically strawmanning the government case to say, we're just going to stop people from saying black people are worse, or make the argument that some people aren't deserving of things, but we need to actually have a specific discussion on what things people are deserving of and what they can achieve, and how this narrative is going to help them achieve that. The main problem with the opposition case that you just heard is the fact that they assume that this narrative automatically gives people human rights, right? When they talk about domestic issues like the treatment of prisoners in the United States, what they assume is that this narrative is just going to give prisoners more rights. In fact, we think this narrative is actually harmful and widens the moral gap between people in power and people people not in power. Kevin gives you a very specific example, which I think is fairly compelling, right? Like if you think of women in Saudi Arabia who rise up every day, many women in this country who say like, we are people and we want human rights, we want to be able to drive, but the men in power do not listen to them perpetuating this narrative. Even though the narrative exists, it is not listened to, and it just widens the power gap because you have many men in power who are just like, no, you don't deserve these human rights, but we don't agree with the statement. And when they can flat out make that statement, it just widens the moral gap and decreases our ability to actually change the power structures that exist in the status quo. So on that note, I want to move on a little bit on the line by line. So first we tell you this creates this notion of like false solvency, that basically the opposition is just perpetuating by saying they somehow have the capability to solve the problems of systematic discrimination just with words, right? Like Emma completely drops the last two arguments. First when we tell you that this creates a narrative of entitlement, when you have like white feminists in Palo Alto who are like, oh, we're suffering from human rights abuses because we don't have perfectly equal wages. Like yes, that's a problem, but we don't think that is a violation of like fundamental human rights, and we think it's wrong for these women to be able to stand up and say we're suffering human rights abuses when you have people who are dying of preventable diseases in the global south, right? Like we think this umbrella term is basically unhelpful and prevents us from being able to solve either problem. On this note, the opposition, thank you.
Despite the fact that there exists an umbrella of human rights, it does not sort of eliminate the fact there are orders of concern. While we care about privacy in the United States, we do not then deny that food and shelter is a first order concern.
Sure, but like the phrase human rights abuses and the universality of the narrative of universality does not like create that order. It does not embody that notion of like priorities, right? It just says like, oh, everyone is the same and everyone deserves like the same human rights, and we think like these general statements erase our ability to actually distinguish between those different orders. Opposition stands up and tells you like, oh, that erasure is good because it builds relatability, because now these white feminists in Palo Alto relate to people in the global south. No, we think it actually diminishes their ability to help. It makes them feel like they are a victim and not in a position. We think the narrative that these women should be embracing is rather that like, I have so much that I ought to give to people who are worse off than me, to people who have less, to people who are in worse situations and have fewer human rights than me. We don't think this narrative of universality actually acknowledges the distinctions between such human rights. And to the idea that white feminists do not leave intersectional people behind because they are like deprived of certain rights, we don't think that's the way like feminism is currently structured, right? Like the way it works is white feminists just get to overshadow their issues because they say like, oh, well, I'm not getting paid, even though I'm like a very famous white actress, because I'm not being paid exactly the same as like my fellow male actors. Like I'm being oppressed, like I'm not getting all my fundamental human rights. Whereas you have women of color who are actually dying and not getting paid for their labor and routinely being exploited and forced to bear children, or like just being beheaded in Saudi Arabia. Like we think comparing the two and having white feminists constantly overshadow the real issues causes a lot of real world problems that they just don't address. My timer just died, so if anyone knows what's going on. Okay, great. So on that note of actual oppression going on in the world, there's one very clear tangible impact coming out of the government case that goes largely unaddressed, right? And that is that this narrative of universality is what constantly justifies intervention. Firstly, because the narrative of universality originated from Western liberal democracies. Like the idea behind the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is basically that the United States gets to dictate what is and what isn't a human right. What happens exactly when this is the case, right? It means that we are allowed to go into other countries as long as they don't adhere to our very stringent definition of human rights and say, like, oh, you're being so mean to your own people, and now we're just going to take over and install, like, our own fake government. This is exactly what happened in Chile, it's exactly what happened in Iran, and oftentimes this is just a guise for economic or political dominance. On that note, we think that on-site government, we're the only people who allow for governments to look different and liberty to look different, right? Like Emma says, like, oh yeah, we're going to like respect dignity and choice, but we think like this is a very vague notion of human rights, and it doesn't actually resolve any issues in the real world, right? Like if you just consider a common feminist issue, abortion, it's just like, oh, are we going to respect like the dignity of the fetus or like the dignity and choice of the woman? Like we don't think like this very vague model that they try and come up with you in opposition is actually satisfactory in terms of solving tangible issues in the real world. We think the government is the only thing that allows you to acknowledge the distinctions and solve tangible problems, right? Like what we have today in the status quo is people listening to the news every day. People come up and they're like, oh, there are human rights abuses going on in Somalia, and they just keep repeating that phrase. There are human rights abuses in Somalia, there are human rights abuses in Somalia, but no one actually knows what the hell is going on in Somalia. No one is aware of the existing power structures or the specific problems because of this narrative of universality that says like, oh yeah, as long as it's just like a human, you can weigh that under with the rest of them. Okay, So we also think like the impacts coming out of the intervention are pretty severe, right? Like we talk about regime change, we tell you that this justifies Western liberal democracies enforcing their form of government, actually removing choice in the long term, a way that is a tangible harm coming out of enforcing this narrative specifically. We think that this actively kills people. You have things like drone strikes that are specifically the result of us saying like, oh, all Islamic women are oppressed, let us go in and deliver their freedom to them forcibly. So this specific narrative is very harmful in that way. We also think the opposition paints a very strong version of the Gov argument is not actually responsive to this case when they're like, oh, well, Gov, basically what they're trying to say is Gov should have to defend that black people are worse, and that is not our case. We're going to defend that the narrative is unhelpful in actually delivering universal human rights to all. We need to solve this in tangible, specific, practical ways, and the opposition fails to do that.
Wait, also just a real quick note, like, stop whispering so loud, because like the recording's right there.
They're gonna have trouble hearing.
It's also just like rude in general to the speaker.
Were we talking about?
Yeah.
Okay, we weren't trying to.
See ya.
The crux of the opening government case is that human rights, as we presently define it, is not doing enough for people around the world. We think that firstly, because they haven't defined to us what they think human rights should be, but secondly, we think that having a concept of the universality of human rights is important, we win on this point. Okay, what am I going to do for you in my speech? Two things. First, I'm going to be looking at the entire opening government case, tell you why it's completely untrue. Secondly, some comparative, and then some framework analysis, tell you why we give you the most important points in this entire round, why we give you the highest impact ideas that will stand throughout this round. Okay, let's get right into some refutation. The first point they come up here and tell us is that we get a false sense of solvency, right? Governments can use this to their advantage and say, oh look, we're doing all these great things when they're actually achieving nothing. Okay, let's talk about this idea of the universality of human rights. We think that firstly, the good thing about having universality of human rights is that it grants people everywhere the same very basic rights. We think that even if these rights weren't enough as they define it, we think that having a basis by which everyone is the same on some level is inherently important. Secondly, we tell you that by having a universal standard, this points out a lot of discrepancies. We know that people in North America are far better off than people in Africa because they have access to things like food and shelter, and by derivative of that, they have things like choice. Okay, then they talk to you about this idea of the narrative entitlement, right? We think, okay, let's just deal with this right now because it really is a very mitigatory harm. Basically, this entire narrative is the idea that, well, people in Palo Alto will say that they deserve human rights, and people in Africa will say they deserve human rights, and somehow by equating those two, you get rid of the idea of human rights and why it's important. Let's just say that the difference in the importance of human rights still exists because just because you stand for the same ends, everyone deserves things like choice and personal self-determination, doesn't mean that you necessarily think that the means to get there is also the same. We can all agree that people in Palo Alto deserve less help than a starving child in Africa because we recognize that the means by which you get to the same ends that everyone is fighting for are vastly different. We think that this whole idea of narrative entitlement therefore falls. Okay, let's talk about this idea of cultural context next, because this is something that they talk about. They say, oh well, a lot of governments are different, therefore intervention is sometimes unjustly created, right? Okay, firstly, on this idea of cultural context, we tell you that in places like Saudi Arabia, where the government is inherently very oppressive to its people, they can use the idea of cultural human rights to hide behind the very terrible things that they're doing. Conversely, we tell you that when we have a thing like universal human rights, we tell you that everyone deserves dignity, respect, and choice, and then women in Saudi Arabia have the agency to say, look, we also deserve this, everyone else agrees, rather than everyone agreeing that human rights should be determined culturally. We think that this is inherently a wall that a lot of these oppressive governments can hide behind. No, thank you. All right, let's talk about this idea of intervention now too, right? Because they say that democracy looks different for different governments. Therefore, universality hurts the idea of governments being able to go into countries and help other people. At the end of the day, we tell you that the
the comparative we give you is still far better than what they're trying to propose, right? We think that by nature of having universality of human rights means that we're still standing for something. Like, even if we don't completely understand the cultural context of women wearing hijabs, I'll take you in a second, we think that it's still far better that we try to grant them agency, that the West go in there and try to grant them what they think is like what they deserve. We think that at the end of the day, we still get better benefits on our side of the house. Yeah, sure.
You say that the comparative is better because you try to grant them agency. So trying to grant them agency by overthrowing their government, sparking a civil war, and killing them ultimately, or making sure that their children can't have food, compares better to what? On our side, we don't do that.
Okay, two ideas. Firstly, like, we don't think that we have to defend what people like prescribe as the universality of human rights. We think that the very idea is that it's important that we have this concept of universality, right? Like, the very fact that we know that we have to go in and fight these wars is because we have a concept of universality. What we wouldn't want to stand for is like a world in which no one minds other people's businesses and like oppression, because we think that they have the right to determine what human rights are. Inherently, we think that we still give you a better world. Okay, the last idea they give you in their like second speech is that we overuse this phrase, therefore we get like less impact every time we use it. We tell you that this is ultimately mitigatory harm because we would rather be still talking about like human rights abuses. It doesn't lose its impact because people use it for like various issues. At the end of the day, we only talk about it because we have the concept of them being deserving of human rights. We think that the very narrative surrounding the fact that everyone deserves a certain level of human rights is very important. This is what Emma gives you a lot of constructive about. Let's see why all of her material still stands. Okay, so she gives you this first idea about combating bias. She tells you that it's like inherently important to ascribe value to each and every person regardless of their circumstance, right? What they tell you is that, okay, it doesn't automatically grant them human rights. Firstly, they're like operating under this idea that human rights is something that's very like ineffective. But secondly, we tell you that even if it doesn't automatically give them all the human rights that we want to, we still have the spaces off of which we can fight for them and like say that, look, the standards are not being met. We think that this narrative is inherently very, very important. Secondly, she gives you this idea about the narrative, how this helps like relatability to like a lot of human rights abuses. Secondly, like how this relates importantly to social movements, how we get better agency when there's this idea of inclusivity and like not wanting to leave any person behind because we agree that everyone deserves a certain level of human rights. We think that this is ultimately incredibly important to this debate because this is how we grant people agency, right? Not only in developing worlds where we like clearly see a lack of like human rights where people are like literally starving, but also in important social movements like the LGBTQ movement or feminism, in which we have more inclusive movements and better movements as a whole because there's this narrative that everyone deserves something and everyone has a buy-in to this idea. They don't give you any refutation on this material, it still stands at the end of the day. Okay, and they also tell you that like we widen this idea of a moral gap, right? Because like with Saudi Arabia, we get more people in power, like justifying their positions. We tell you that there's like no mechanism by which they prove this, and we think that protection by like having differences in human rights grants them more like ability to create a moral gap. We think that at the end of the day, what we want to do with the idea of like a universality of human rights is to grant people more agency. So here's a framework by which you should judge us around. Here's a comparative why we win. We think that, okay, firstly, what we want to do is grant people more agency. We think that this is incredibly important, not only for things like preserving human life, but also for like better social movements, better economic movements. We think that when we have this idea of universality, like versus not having it, we care more about everyone in the game. Like we don't subscribe people to like a certain like level of value because of their culture or any of their beliefs or their circumstances. We think this is inherently incredibly important. Secondly, we tell you this creates better equality, right? This is essentially what Emma tells you when she tells you that like universality combats bias. We don't think that this content is well contended with by the government side because they don't give you any material to believe that having like non-universality somehow grants more equality. What they tell you that is that universality is an ineffectual standard by which governments hide behind, which we've already debunked for you. So at the end of the day, you must go off. Thank you.
Sick squad.
Yeah, they're both sick.
Oh,
They need a fun
that's
team.
like a
man.
Drake thing.
Sick squad.
Like they cough on cue.
It's her signaling mechanism. Yeah, I can read this, it's fine. It's even worse.
Kevin's writing is even smaller.
I know, but I'm used to him being ridiculous. I don't expect it from others.
It's better than not being able to see the writing.
Yeah.
Just one thing, so.
Business rights clear. terrible.
It's not that
pencil
bad.
that's super cheap.
So light.
No one can read it,
It
but
is really
himself.
light. I'll admit it's really
Let
light.
him go, you might die.
I apologize. He'll die later too.
I mean, if I'm gonna die later, that means like I shouldn't really be at this world's trial.
And the spot's forfeited.
Clearly you died, calm down.
Okay, ready when you are.
Note that we aren't talking about some sort of ideal world where everybody adheres to a particular concept of universality that's perfect and all human rights are well and good. Recognize that instead what actually exists here is that we have a very, very westernized definition of universality that is codified in international institutions like the UN, like the ICC, like the ICJ. We say that the problem here is we prevent things like iteration to ensure that we actually get the best possible mechanisms, the best possible systems that exist worldwide that can be best for people as a whole. That's going to be what my extension is going to be about. After that, like rebuttal of everything you heard out of on this extension. So we say what here is that we prevent the optimization of iteration of society towards what it can be best possibly be. We aren't specifically saying that certain things are necessarily best. We're saying that we don't necessarily know what is best under the status quo. We think that this is the mechanism by which we actually ensure we get the potential to get what is actually best for society. 3 problems that actually exist under the status quo. Firstly, let's talk about otherization. What exists when you have universal human rights is that you have, for example, relatively liberal Muslim states, but because of the fact that women in a lot of cases are suggested or pressured to wear hijabs, they are seen as an other, and therefore other states are unwilling to, let's say, form agreements with them, trade with them, or individual citizens from those particular states are actually going to be otherized, prejudiced against, insofar as they don't adhere to a Western definition of universality. Second problem that we see is the bastardization of human rights. Recognize that Declaration of Human Rights under the UN, it also includes things like internet use, and also includes things like privacy, which are very, very Western ideals and very, very Western concepts. The problem that exists here is that this is often used as a mechanism to sort of directly counter against non-Western states. We don't think that's particularly good, but secondly, we think it makes it relatively unclear exactly what human rights priorities are, insofar as you have this giant laundry list in terms of something like internet use and something like, free speech are put on exactly the same playing field, or something like, food, water, housing. Third thing that we're going to talk about is in terms of preference, because recognize what we talk about here is that you have a relatively Western-centric viewpoint, but sure, Catherine.
In a world where you don't have a universal standard, then a country can say, well, no, women's rights aren't so important to us, therefore we don't really care about fighting for their rights.
So we don't think this is something that realistically exists here. So before you had universal codified human rights, you had still suffrage movement that exists within countries like the UK, right? So we don't think that it has to be something that's internationally codified as definitively universal in order for people to make pushes for their individual rights insofar as that's something that they actually care about. Okay, about this idea of Western-centric preference. The problem is that the narrative of universality is focused entirely on international conventions that are centered around Western values, because Western states are a lot of cases the ones that, let's say, have had prominent spots in the Security Council or prominent spots in the negotiating table when actually dealing with the addressing exactly what these human rights should be. What does that mean? That means that things like, for example, democracy are prioritized over benevolent dictatorships that might actually work better in particular circumstances, i.e. in terms of Ghana under Rawlings or Singapore, as another example. Second thing, what we say is that things like, for example, individualism of citizens is prioritized over, let's say, collective societies that we see in areas like East Asia. We see that that's a problem. 3 impacts that exist as a result of the 3 things that I've talked about here. So first of all, we think that people within minorities, a lot of these groups, are much more likely to be subjugated to prejudice. We think that what happens to countries as well. Secondly, we think you have a lot of international clash between large powers with differing systems, insofar as those other large powers don't actually have Western systems that are codified in international legislation. So i.e. this is why you have a lot of conflict between the United States and China. We think that that's suboptimal in terms of things like trade negotiations that can be better for citizens in both parties. Thirdly, we think this is the most important thing under this extension is that you prevent the optimization of particular societies. So recognize you don't actually get, let's say, benevolent dictatorships to actually flourish on their side of the house, because they're actually going to be quashed by things like international intervention or by more subliminal pressures by other states not actually wanting to engage in things like democratic negotiations, or NGOs pressuring these states to act towards these sorts of universal human rights, even though these sorts of other systems, if allowed to flourish properly and develop properly without these sorts of external influences, might actually provide tangible benefits that actually could be iterated upon, actually attached on by other societies. Thirdly, we say that what ends up happening here is that, let's say something like China does something that's particularly great, but it's something that is in clash with what is universally defined as actually being good in terms of human rights. We see that other states don't want to actually take on those particular mechanisms that have been developed by these other states, insofar as they say that it's against their particular values, right, that have been defined universally. So because you have this sort of Western definition, other states are less likely to actually differ from that, even though it's actually going to be better in the long run. So crucially, what we talk about here is that iteration is something that's necessarily good, so we get the best possible society as a whole. That doesn't happen on their side of the house. Okay, rebuttal. First, a few things that they talk about here. The first thing that they talk about is this idea of combating bias. I think I've already answered this in my POI when I talk about you don't really need this idea of universality in order for individuals and groups within states to actually try to push for their rights. So we think that that's something that's necessarily going to happen either way. Second thing that we talk about is that we don't get excuses on the part of a large international parties to actually intervene within states under the pretext of human rights. So we say what ends up happening is that a country like the United States goes into Libya because it doesn't think it's actually adhering with human rights properly for its citizens, makes that situation much, much worse. We don't actually think you get solvency on a lot of those cases. Third thing that we say is that bias exists massively on their side of the house because the sorts of societies that are actually prioritized are things like Western liberal democracies or things like, let's say, like individualism. We say that that's not necessarily what is actually best for society, and even so, these two things can potentially exist simultaneously in ways that are both actually functional, this protected time. So we don't think that this ends up actually affecting, we don't think that you actually allow these other societies to properly flourish and actually provide the necessary benefits that they potentially can for their citizens. Fourthly, we say this also clashes precisely against what they say about things like social movements and understanding, insofar as this creates lack of understanding strictly between states, or a lot of social movements, again, in direct opposition to the particular values that might potentially be beneficial if iterated on in the long run. So we don't think that's actually good. Crucially, what we actually get on our side is more agency for these particular states and groups to actually improve on their own societal structures without this sort of external influence in terms of either direct engagement, in terms of things like intervention, but also in terms of more subliminal messaging, in terms of not actually wanting to do democratic negotiations or not wanting allowing for their participation in international agreements. Crucially, what we talked about here on closing government is that functionally we want the best possible society as a whole. We say that what we actually want to, how we actually achieve that is not by this Western definition of what is considered universal human rights codified within international institutions. We say that we regret that notion. What we prefer is one that we can actually move towards the sorts of institutions and the sorts of societies that can work best for everyone proud to propose.
Honorable Speaker, this debate has fundamentally missed the comparative, particularly on government side. They have utterly failed to negotiate or to interact with what happens when you have a universal moral system. They have instead premised their arguments entirely on pointing out examples when it fails and ignoring the utter terror that will occur on their side of the house. First, extraneous rebuttal to what we just heard, moving on to top half, and then addressing the biggest point of clash in the round on intervention, why we think we're winning on this 4 sub-points, and then finally our extension on why we think we need consistent and universal moral systems in general. Okay, responding to top half. Bottom half. Firstly, I don't think we need to defend a UN or a hyper-Western perspective. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the sort of idea of universality exists. If the argument he's trying to make is that the privileged tend to dictate the narrative, then this is okay. We're willing to even take that harm on our side of the house, particularly because our first argument will tell you how you iterate to a better system. Second, let's start a second point here, seem to be utility. That sometimes it's better to violate human rights because it results in a more apt system. I mean, basically just fuck that. I don't want to do that. I think that's an awful idea. But also, I need you to notice something here. This isn't a unique mechanism or particularly unique argument. What it is it's sort of bringing up a unique impact of what OG already told you on intervention. We're going to absolutely destroy that out. Okay, few responses to top half before going into intervention. Okay, the entire first argument is basically just a series of false equivalencies. So first, the universality of human rights is not based on one document. I feel the need to echo this once again. Entitlement doesn't equal misunderstanding or conflation of human rights. It means that I think I have privacy, but as I stated in my POI, more importantly, Africans and other people deserve food. Like, I think we can have priorities within a universal list of human rights. Violet absolutely fumbles this POI, and Luke disappointingly even returns to repeating this point by basically just saying, semantics, we call it universal, and people are too fucking stupid to understand that universal can be applied in order, right? There could be first order concerns and second order concerns and third order concerns which still apply to all people. This is disappointing and defeats huge swaths of arguments on their side of the house. Finally, important mitigatory argument is that Western oppression occurs in many ways beyond just intervention by human rights. I think they failed to sort of realize this nuance, that we can intervene via economics, trade, all other concerns, and simply claim it's for something outside of this. Moving on to intervention. Okay. 4 points specifically focused on the comparative as to why I think we win regarding intervention. Firstly, note that intervention is often not bad. I think intervening in Nazi Germany, regardless of how bad you think the United States, was probably a good thing. But secondly, less common example, is like intervention in Japan. Like, I'm sorry, but the War of Japan was genuinely worth it when you consider the sort of imperialistic nature of Japan, the rape of Nanking, the importing of sex slaves from Korea, etc., etc. These are human rights atrocities by which wars themselves were worth having to stop. Secondly, and more importantly than this point, is do the comparative. So we admit, sometimes intervention is flawed. You might even say it's flawed the majority of the time. This is irrelevant when you consider that on their side of the house, they have endless oppression or atrocities. Why? Because a nation or a culture where they define their relativistic morality, their relativistic sense of human rights, can only stop via domestic forces. On their side of the house, they say the Rohingya Muslims need to figure it out because in Myanmar society, it is okay to consider them non-human. We do not think that is okay. We think when you have infinite travesties, infinite atrocities occurring, you ultimately lose in the weighing. Third point, sympathy brought up by top half. I don't think they successfully respond to this. Fourth and finally, justifiability. Their argument here is that you can justify intervention, which ultimately is like that. I think what's more important is in their side of the house, you can particularly easily justify violations of human rights because it is even easier to simply pick a moral system or define your culture as you see fit. I.e., think of Mugabe and Maduro, who have all of their citizens starving and then saying, no, you stupid Western imperialists, this is how we operate. You just don't understand Kenya. People like to starve in Kenya. Like, we don't think that is a valid solution. Unsurprisingly, who gets to craft this narrative? It is ultimately those in these countries who then have the extreme power to say, no, this is how we operate, because those at the bottom who are truly marginalized cannot speak up about the rights which they should have access to. Catherine even starts to get it citing the POI, in which Luke basically just returns to the semantic argument. I don't think this is powerful enough to beat your question.
You talk about Maduro. Our dear orange dictator would like to overthrow Maduro and kill millions of people in Venezuela because he is mistreating his people. How does a Western intervention that necessarily leads to a civil war and destabilizes the country ever lead to good outcomes on your side?
Examples of the Ivory Coast and Tunisia beat the notion that it will always lead to civil war, but secondly, I think it's important to know that oftentimes a war is worth having because in the long term, infinite oppression will outweigh your war. Okay, on to our extension, consistency of moral systems. Above all else, a moral system should be consistent. Human rights is you're going to like this or not. Human rights is of course a moral system and perhaps the most important one. Relativistic / non-universality is definitionally inconsistent. The same action can be ethical or non-ethical depending on where or who commits it. This is fundamentally flawed, and as Kant noted, this is the minimum needed for a moral framework to be successful. But why is consistency so important just beyond our own like Kant? Okay, so two significant points, I should say, as to why this is true. Firstly, iteration, secondly, descriptive versus prescriptive. Okay, on the first point, we have ability to actually iterate and improve via discussion, discourse, even intervention, etc. on our side of the house, which they don't have despite what their contention says. Two subpoints as to why this is true. Firstly, we need to agree there is a goal to actually cooperate towards something. If there is no goal, i.e. a universal or perfect ethics, then no interaction will ever occur. You have no motivation because you have nothing by which you are seeking to go towards. We say then the very things that cause moral systems to advance, primarily like discussion, iteration, or self-introspection, etc., do not occur because all of your systems exist within the vacuum of their own culture or nation. But third, this is sort of amplified by like Goodell's incompleteness proof that Pranav is proud of me for mentioning, which basically says there is no perfect moral system, which means ultimately your only hope for achieving successful morality is continuing to iterate towards a better one. Second large point under here is descriptive versus prescriptive. The goal of ethics, we tell you, is to dictate action. We say otherwise it is not particularly useful. And why would their relativistic human rights always be inherently descriptive? Firstly, because it is an assessment that must come after, because now context matters. Because there are no universal groundwork, you cannot judge the action until after it has been completed, in which case you can assess the culture and the sort of the person who did it. We don't think this is effective. But secondly, cultures and nations change, and third and finally, cultures lack clear boundaries. This means you have the ability in which you must sit there sort of arguing about what is human rights under this case, when is something an ethical or an unethical violation. It must all occur after the fact. In other words, you lose the greatest benefit of ethics, the greatest benefit of moral systems or human rights in general, in which we can dictate how we act in the future to try to prevent these atrocities proud to oppose.
Did your stupid ass star shit.
Welcome to the club.
Cough for me, daddy. Can I borrow someone's timer? My phone's on the other. Thank you. Cough for me, daddy. Jesus Christ.
I was going to bend me over.
There it is.
Don't bend me over for now.
Sorry, like 2 seconds to organize this shit.
One.
Okay. Okay, now you're just writing shit. Come on.
Yeah, well, come on now. Okay, come on. No.
Alright.
Also, that's my pen. Who gave it to me? Ariana gave it to me a while back. Now it's mine.
Alright. Are we all ready?
Yeah. We've been ready.
What Luke and I told you is that the human journey is one of iteration. We rely on the marketplace of ideas to allow for society to progress in an effective manner to its optimal configuration. Recently, however, we would tell you that the arc of history is slowed almost to a stop. Mr. Speaker, it is not because we have reached this global optimum that we have stopped. It's because the institution of human rights purported by the West has slowed us down such that we cannot iterate. This is the critical extension that Luke gave you that went nearly unresponded to in that last speech, and we will win government this round. Before I begin, some extraneous rebuttal. What we get out of this, out of CO, is first that some rebuttal where he says that human rights narratives don't have to be UN-based and they don't have to be Western-based. I think he kind of concedes the fact that these institutions of human rights are built by the West, that they are furthered by those in power because those are the ones with the privilege to do so, right? The institutions of the UN and other things that would foment these sorts of narratives are built by the West and are therefore influenced by Western perspectives of these different things. The fact that Luke uses examples of the UN and that no one on the opposition bench has given us any other conception of human rights, universal human rights narratives that have been furthered in the public means that the only ones that we can think of are Western-centric in and of themselves. I think those examples speak plenty for why these are Western-centric narratives. The second thing Dennis gives you is that he gives you this point on how intervention is sometimes good, that the people in Ghana need food sometimes and that we should give them food. Okay. Here's a little bit of a point that I think they miss. You don't have to tell me, your job on opposition is not to prove that universal human rights exist. It's to prove that the narrative of universal human rights specifically allows for and causes these sorts of good interventions that you would have on your side of the house. We would tell you that those interventions, by your own metric, your own speech, your own logic, don't happen because the US has an interest in preserving universal basic human rights that is furthered by this narrative, but rather is serving its own economic and political interests. At that point, you need to show us why this universal human rights narrative is actually causing these interventions to happen. Otherwise, you can't claim any of those benefits for your side of the house. No, thank you. Thirdly, he tells you that moral systems should be consistent, and basically spends about 5 minutes of my argumentation in 2 rounds that I had with him in the last 2 debate tournaments back at me. A few problems with this. First of all, the motion is not whether human rights are universal or not universal. The motion is about whether the narrative of universal human rights is a good thing or a bad thing. He fundamentally misses this, right? We're fine with saying that perhaps some human rights are universal, but we tell you that the narrative has been bastardized by these Western nations, and that is what the problem is. The second thing is that even if it is the case that all of these Western, or the majority of these Western human rights are true, we would like to tell a Darwinistic truth. There's one of your arguments back at you, Dennis. A Darwinistic truth that we would rather lie to everyone and say that this is not universal so that people can iterate and we may get to a system where we actually approach a societally optimal system. Okay, two questions that I'm going to go over then. First, why do we still get development of certain agreeable tenets of human rights, such as equity, women's suffrage, and value on life? And secondly, why development of societal systems is the most important thing in this debate, and why that uniquely only happens absent this narrative of universal human rights. Before I go on, opening.
Isn't the narrative that all people universally deserve the right to self-determination what tells us that the Western interventions you hate so much are bad?
Okay. I'm okay with saying Western interventions are sometimes good. I'm also okay with saying that sometimes, and the vast majority of instances, they're very bad, as Kevin told you on OG. I don't think the differentiating factor there is that the ones that are good were motivated by universal basic human rights narratives, and the ones that were bad were motivated by economic and political incentives. I think they were both motivated by economic and political incentives, and they rolled the dice, and sometimes they ended up okay, right? Like, that's not sufficient for you to claim those benefits. Okay. First, why do we still get development of certain agreeable tenets of human rights on our side, absent a narrative of universal human rights? Number one, Luke tells you that through history, we have iterated to a point in society, like slavery doesn't exist in the vast majority of the world right now in different societies, right? Even though these societies have different conceptions of human rights, and not all of them ascribe to universal human rights narratives that have been furthered by the West largely after the 1940s. What this means is that we were able to come to some sort of agreement through empirically through history. Second of all, if these human rights are truly universal, then it kind of begs to reason that they would come about in every society regardless of an overarching narrative. Like, that's the fact that they're universal, is that every group of humans should come to this conclusion that they're human rights. But thirdly, dictators and ISIS don't change their biases because of a narrative that the international community tells them, right? They don't care about geopolitical disapproval. They don't care about the institutions of human rights and the narratives told by the West. They're just going to continue being terrible. Second of all, the West and the US don't intervene because of the narrative of human rights. They intervene when it's in their interest to do so, and they use these human rights as a justification. Insofar as Kevin tells you that the interventions are largely bad and literally just on a probability perspective, probably worse than for the country that you're intervening than better, that these excuses are what lets the American public get dragged into things like Iraq, but doesn't help when Rwanda or Kosovo happen. If it was the case that we always intervened when it was in the interest of human rights based on this narrative, we would have intervened in Kosovo and Rwanda. So how does this actually affect everything? We tell you that it distances the East from the West because people discard as barbaric everything that doesn't fall in line with Western conceptions of human rights, because that's what the narrative has told everyone on the base. Why is this development of societal systems most important in this debate? 3 reasons. 1, we have absolutely no guarantee that we are at the optimal point in society. In fact, if history teaches us anything, we certainly are not. Secondly, the history of human iteration is to chip away at institutions of power structures. We think that this institution of human rights is another manifestation of Western power structures. What this looks like is the condemnation of protectionism in nascent economies that allows the West to just flood their market with goods and disallow any sort of local development. These are the things that ingrain power structures. Thirdly, and finally, I'm fundamentally unsatisfied with the status quo, right? The history of the human race has been one of iteration. I don't want to see the institutions of the West browbeat us into stagnancy. Luke gave you 3 sophisticated reasons why we don't get this iteration. He told you about otherization, he told you about the bastardization of human rights, and thirdly, he told you about the preferences of Western-centric rights over others. All 3 of those prevent development and iteration towards a better societal system. We think that is the most important thing in this round. It is what makes us human, it is what makes us better in the long term, and we're incredibly proud to propose because of it.
It just goes.
Zeta whip.
This
And
is
just
just
yell
true.
at it
That's,
last
that's, I just can't. Alright. Okay. When closing government admits himself that sometimes intervention has good aims, and sometimes it results in good things for the most oppressed people in society. That's the point at which you get all of the things that Dennis talks about, and all the things that opposition has been arguing about this entire debate. Just a quick roadmap before I continue my speech. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about what we've heard from both talk paths about who better helps those who are most vulnerable, because that's what we agree on both sides is the objective of universal human rights in general. And secondly, I'm going to be talking about why ethics falls apart and why our extension is a voting matter and why it's the most important thing in this debate and why it was completely improperly refuted by the whip on government. So firstly, let's talk about who exactly helps the most vulnerable people. So both sides agree that this is the most disadvantaged, the most poor. Great. So on top half, we get this idea that cultural appropriative intervention is really bad, and that a hijabi woman in Iran should be able to do that and shouldn't be oppressed by Western. This is kind of tied to closing halves, and we think this argument kind of derives from there. So this rebuttal would kind of be interwoven. Firstly, we think that the comparative that we see here is that intervention in any capacity, if it is going to help individuals, that's great. We see that if you respect this arbitrary idea for cultural appropriation to be upheld, then you sacrifice all the material gains you get when you intervene in heinous situations. Secondly, top half brings this idea that entitlement at the expense of the poor is really important. And Dennis talks to you about that, about what exactly happens under this entitlement. This is kind of touched on by top half too, about how that's not exactly what happens, ladies and gentlemen. Entitlement without universality isn't going to go towards the poor and towards the rich. What's going to happen is privilege is cemented instead. We don't think that necessarily this point is specifically no thank you. So now let's talk about what bottom half says. And this is kind of this extension that they bring up, and this is ultimately the biggest clash we see in this debate. This idea about intervention, whether or not this is good or bad, and whether or not Western imperialism is really a voting matter. So firstly, they tell you that there are other types of government, these are being oppressed by the Western ideal of human rights. Firstly, we think that that's not entirely the point, right? The point is that we have a framework, some sort of basis of understanding to determine when human rights are necessarily exist and for who. We think the point is that you don't have no thank you. When you have this relativism that Dennis talks about, this is extremely important, right? Because then you can no longer determine any sort of consistency what humans basically have. Now let's talk about this kind of somewhat derivative point they bring up about Western imperialism, and this kind of relates to the whole cultural appropriation thing, right? So firstly, on the idea of all the perspectives, both Eastern, Western, the African Union, whatever you want to talk about, can follow a universal narrative, but they only go head to head and compete when we believe in universal rights, and it's extremely important, especially in your marketplace of ideas. And secondly, on the idea of narrative versus actual universality, all of our arguments exist and manifest if people follow the belief in a perfect morality to work towards, whether you call it a narrative or not. This doesn't make a significant difference. Sure.
Okay.
Luke.
Okay. So what this narrative means is the West can basically codify things into international law, then bash other states on it with a hammer in that sense, so that they can't actually iterate and actually provide other alternatives that might actually be beneficial.
Okay, so firstly, we don't exactly agree with the idea that Western ideals necessarily are purposed to bash down on the great governments we see in the developing world. We think that on comparative, it's more suited to help people who live there, human rights, basic human rights, as codified in the UN or whatever charter you want to talk about, or in general, are about basic human rights to live, human rights to survive. They don't necessarily aren't as specific as this narrative that you're trying to talk about. So let's talk about lastly this kind of idea of a Western imperialism and why ultimately this is not something that's extremely relevant in this debate, and why the impacts that we talked to you about on our side and the comparative that we show you is far more important. We tell you that this is the case because even if sometimes we intervene and things don't exactly go our way, or that there results in negative ramifications, we think that the comparatives that you get no intervention at all, insofar as countries no longer have any justification, any narrative justification you want to talk about to intervene. We tell you that Dennis tells you very clearly that the point at which you
don't allow like human rights to be a narrative that's persistent in order to reinforce interventions when you get no intervention at all. We think that's far worse when you have Rohingya dying in the Bay of Bengal because of oppressive governments that don't believe they're actually human to begin with. No. So let me talk to you about the most important things in this debate, and that's the extension that Dennis brings up, right? Because we tell you that consistency in a moral system is extremely important. We tell you that when human rights is incredibly relative, we tell you that like that consistency is completely like disbanded. We tell you the importance of this in international law and why this is like necessary in order for us to assess certain crises and tell whether or not we should intervene or not because of the descriptive and prescriptive nature. Dennis tells you this very clearly. The only response we get is that like, oh, like this is not really what we're talking about. We're talking about the narrative that's been bastardized by the West and that we like regret that the idea of universality has happened. No, when you regret universality, you regret the framework that it also creates. You regret the consistency that it creates in the international community and the discourse it provides. And that's what we tell you on our side, right? We think that universality is necessary in and of itself in order to create this sort of equal weighing mechanism, this sort of a way to make sure that equality and ethics as like a mode to decide what is good and what is bad, that still exists. So why is what we tell you a voting matter, right? Because firstly, we kind of disband like the entire bench of government, which tells you that like Western imperialism is bad, cultural appropriation is bad. We tell you that like our side argues for far like more material gains, i.e. that like we get more intervention and we get like more solvency for people who are actually suffering, if that's what we want to talk about. And secondly, we provide an actual framework for deciding things like morality, things like ethics, which are incredibly important, right? Because even if we're not talking about like imperial hegemony, and like if that's the most important impact you want to talk about, what we're talking about is the actual ability we have to solve human rights issues and the abuse of individuals in our society. The point at which government agrees that is the most important thing in this debate, that the solvency for people who are most subjugated to oppression is the most important thing in this debate, is the point at which you obviously have to vote for closing opposition, right? Because we're the only team that shows you why exactly it is the case, intrinsically, that relativism doesn't provide any solvency for these people, both in the past and in the future. Today's closing government has shown you very clearly why all down the bench that we are the consistent team. First of all, and second of all, we're the team that actually cares about the issues that matter today. Because we provide you the voting framework and because we destroy the entire analysis that we get that ultimately fundaments on this idea of Western imperialism that really just has no impacts or grounds, we're so proud to oppose.
I really apologize.
I will never, ever forgive you for not
about to
starting your
pass
speech
out.
with the greatest
I was
trick
pretty
the
zoned out
devil
as well.
ever pulled.
It is a
Closing
big small I forgot to mention, but one thing I forgot to mention is
I
like
honestly like halfway through this because
concrete proof of the things that I was talking about.
Yeah.